Ergativity for Novices Part 1 Morphological Ergativity Case Marking, Agreement, and Word Order. This video is an adaptation of a thread called Ergativity for Novices on the ZBB written by Bradron, who kindly permitted me to reproduce it in this form. I have edited and trimmed it, but it remains mostly the same. You can find a link to the introduction, Part 0, in the description below, which I highly recommend looking at before this one because it goes over certain terminology we'll be using. Also, I'll be using these symbols from time to time as a various shorthand. For nominative accusative alignments, a pointed finger, because you point at people when you accuse them of something. For ergative absolutive alignments, a wrench, because this represents work, which is the meaning of the Greek word ergon, from which the word ergativity arises. And for tripartite alignments, a trident. I think the symbolism here should be obvious. And with that preamble out of the way, let us begin.
What is morphological ergativity? The term morphological ergativity refers to those areas of ergativity which are directly reflected in the morphology of a language, that is, ergative case marking and ergative verbal agreement. Dixon occasionally terms this area of ergativity intraclausal ergativity, which is certainly a more precise term, but which is also slightly too unwieldy for my taste. Ergative case marking refers to the situation in which one noun case is used for A arguments and another is used for S and O arguments, while ergative verbal agreement refers to the situation in which one set of verbal agreement affixes is used for A arguments and another is used for S and O arguments. A very similar, though rare, phenomenon is ergative word order, in which one position in the sentence is used for A arguments and another is used for S and O arguments. It can be hard to know how to categorize this. You might think that, as a matter of syntax, this should be treated as a facet of syntactic ergativity rather than morphological ergativity, but it doesn't seem particularly similar to the other phenomena treated as syntactically ergative, though further investigation is needed. On the other hand, like the other phenomena covered in this video, word order is concerned with identifying which noun phrase corresponds to S, A, and O. For this reason, I will cover it here. Ergative case marking. Case marking in ergative languages works in a pretty similar manner to case marking in non-ergative languages, except for the fact that the two main cases are ergative for A and absolutive for S and O, rather than, say, nominative and accusative. They have much the same morphological possibilities too. Cases may be expressed as affixes, as in the deable examples mentioned in Part 0, What is Ergativity? Or they may be expressed with particles or adpositions, as with Tongan. This example is from Dixon, who doesn't provide glosses, but I have made my own by referencing C. Maxwell Churchward's 1953 Tongan grammar. For clarity, the noun phrases are chunked off with square brackets. Na e lea a tolu, na e lea a e tolovou, na e tāma tei a e talovou e tolu. Note that a Tongan sentence begins with the verb, here either intransitive lea, speak, or transitive tāma tei, kill, followed by the arguments of that verb, introduced using either e, the ergative marker, or a, the absolutive marker. And yes, it's a little confusing that the ergative marker and the definite article are the same, except that the ergative marker begins with a glottal stop. As with non-ergative languages, it is much less common for languages to use particles or adpositions rather than affixes for case marking, but the examples here demonstrate that both are possible. Markedness in case marking. An important topic in ergative case marking is that of markedness. However, before discussing this topic, I want to note that this term has two closely related meanings, which should be disambiguated. The first is that of formal markedness, which relates to which affix, in a system of affixes, or particles, etc., has the simplest or most basic form. Often, the formally unmarked affix is 0, whereas all the other affixes in the system have a non-zero realization. The second is that of functional markedness, which relates to which affix in a system of affixes, etc., has the more usual or more normal meaning. See Oestendahl's 1985 book, Tense and Aspect Systems. For example, one could make a case that the English third-person singular agreement affix s is formally marked. All other agreement affixes are zero, but functionally unmarked, because most normal sentences use this suffix. With regards to markedness and case marking, one generalization is very clear. If any case is formally and functionally unmarked, it will be the case that covers S. That is, the unmarked case will be nominative in a nominative accusative language, or absolutive in an ergative absolutive language. For instance, in the deable examples earlier, the ergative case has a non-zero suffix, whereas the absolutive case is zero. This generalization holds true for all known ergative languages and almost all nominative accusative languages, and the exceptions to this will be covered later. The major consequence of this fact is that many phenomena appear reversed compared to a nominative accusative language like English, because in ergative absolutive languages the quote-unquote main unmarked transitive argument is O rather than A. For instance, accusative languages often have a passive voice which promotes the O argument to the ostensibly more important A argument. By contrast, ergative languages often have an anti-passive voice which promotes the A argument to the ostensibly more important O argument. Another example. In a construction like I saw him and laughed, in English the omitted argument is assumed to be A, but in some ergative languages it is assumed that that argument is O instead. Such phenomena will be dealt with in the section on syntactic ergativity later. In my opinion, this reversal is one of the most frequently confusing things about ergative languages, so it is important to be aware of this at an early stage. Another important consequence of markedness is related to the function of the more marked case. In both nominative and ergative languages, the more marked case, that is accusative or ergative, is more likely to have functions beyond simply marking the O or A status of its noun phrase. For instance, the Latin accusative case also covers place to which there is motion, extent in time and space, and certain adverbial relations. Similarly, the ergative also often covers locative, instrumental, genitive, or other meanings, although there are some languages, such as Basque, which do have a quote-unquote pure ergative case. Now this isn't to say that these other functions will always appear, just that they often do. Finally, it seems that if the verb agrees with only one case role, it will agree with the unmarked case. For instance, in nominative accusative languages, the verb often agrees with the nominative argument only, but there are no languages in which the verb agrees with the accusative argument only. Similarly, in ergative absolutive languages, the verb may agree with the absolutive argument only, but never with the ergative argument only. Side note. There do exist so-called marked nominative systems, which are clearly nominative accusative, but have the accusative unmarked rather than the nominative. These systems are pretty much restricted to some northern African languages from the Afro-Asiatic and Nilotic families, although they are also found in the Yuman family from the area where California meets Mexico. These systems are in some ways midway between ergative and normal nominative accusative languages, or they could alternatively be viewed as ergative languages where the marked ergative case has been extended to cover the S role. Dixon notes that this is not an easy terminological question. These systems, although nominative accusative in form, show several phenomena more characteristic of ergative languages. For instance, the citation form of words is often the unmarked accusative, and so is the complement of the verb to be. There are some other languages in which phonological change has led to an apparent marked nominative system. For instance, in some older Germanic languages, the Proto-Indo-European accusative am has disappeared, whereas the nominative os has not. But in these systems, the nominative is still functionally unmarked. Another ambiguous example is English, in which the accusative pronoun me is functionally unmarked relative to the nominative pronoun I. Yet English is never termed a marked nominative. It appears that a language must have an accusative which is consistently and unambiguously both formally and functionally unmarked to qualify as a marked nominative. Ergative verbal agreement. I'm sure that we are all familiar with verbal agreement, also sometimes called cross-referencing, the phenomenon where the verb or verbal auxiliary contains affixes which provide information about the person, number, gender, or other attribute of one or more arguments. Often, these agreement markers provide evidence of morphological accusativity or ergativity. First, an example from Swahili.
Mlianguka, alianguka, mlimwona, aliwaona.
Ignoring the past tense prefix li, it is clear that Swahili has one set of agreement markers for S and A and another for O. Additionally, S and A always appear before the tense marker, whereas O appears afterwards. Thus, it is clear that Swahili verbal agreement shows an accusative pattern. Similarly, there are also languages with an ergative system of agreement. An example is Sakapultek Maya. Shatakek, Shakek, Shachiyang, Shatrichiyang. Ignoring the completive aspect marker sh and the transitivity markers ek and ang for the intransitive and transitive respectively, this is clearly an ergative system rather than an accusative one, with one set of agreement markers for S and O and another for A. As with Swahili, the agreement markers have a particular order. S and O always appear first, and A appears afterwards. Additionally, note that the third person singular is unmarked, but only with S and O. This coincides with the earlier discussion about markedness, where it was mentioned that it is always the absolutive that is unmarked relative to the ergative. Thus, it is clear that Sakapultek verbal agreement shows an ergative pattern. There are also some languages in which the verb only agrees with one of its arguments. Some familiar examples are the nominative accusative languages of Indo-European, in which the verb agrees with S and A, but not O. Similarly, there are some ergative languages, such as the North Caucasian language Avar and Canela Craiol from the J family, in which the verb agrees with S and O, but not A. This was briefly discussed earlier along with marking. If the verb agrees with one argument, it will be that argument which corresponds to the less marked case, either nominative or
Absolutive.
Another common phenomenon is for languages to have a synchronically unanalyzable set of agreement markers for all A plus O combinations, and another set of prefixes for S. In some ways, this could be considered as a type of tripartite marking. But in all known languages, or at least the vast majority which do this, the A plus O prefixes developed from recognizably separate A and O affixes, one of which was the same as or nearly identical to S. Dixon writes that he knows of no language which has a tripartite system of agreement across all tenses and aspects. However, he states that the Mayan language Chorti comes close. In the imperfective aspect, there is a separate set of agreement markers for each of S, A, and O. But in the perfective aspect, the O markers are used for S as well. It is worth noting that ergativity in verbal agreement seems to be rarer than ergative case marking. McGregor points out that according to WALS, the World Atlas of Language Structures, 17% of a sample of 190 languages have ergative case marking, whereas only 5% of a sample of 380 languages have ergative verbal agreement. Although I have a suspicion that this dataset underrepresents areas which contain particularly many languages with ergative agreement. The relationship between ergative verbal agreement and case marking. For the most part, languages, whether accusative, ergative, or neither, tend to use either verbal agreement, head marking, or case marking, dependent marking, but not both, double marking. For instance, Sakapultek uses only verbal agreement, whereas Diable uses only case marking. However, the use of both is common enough that their co-occurrence should be discussed. The most surprising thing about double marking languages is that not all combinations are equally plausible. For instance, accusative agreement and ergative case marking is relatively common, whereas ergative agreement and accusative case marking is practically non-existent. The various cases can be summarized in a table. based on Ellen Wilford's paper Ergative Agreement Systems and Amy Deal's Ergativity Handbook. The various cases here can be summarized as a universal. If a language has accusative case marking, then it cannot have any form of ergative verbal agreement. However, there are a few subtleties to be aware of here. The J language Canela seems to be a partial exception to this universal. Canela has nominative accusative case marking on pronouns, and no case marking on other nouns, the same system as English. However, the verb agrees with S and O, an ergative agreement system in a partially accusative case marking system. There seem to be no languages in which nouns have no case marking, but verbs agree with only the absolutive argument. However, I do have a suspicion that this may be an accidental gap. As far as I am aware, there are very few languages in general where verbal agreement is only with the absolutive argument, and it could be an accident that all such languages also have case marking. For the reasons described earlier in section 1.3 on markedness and case marking, there should be no languages where the verb agrees with the ergative argument alone. Such a situation would be akin to an accusative language in which agreement is only with the accusative argument. There do seem to be at least two partial exceptions to this general rule, but both are unusual cases. In halcamelum, the verb only agrees with the third-person ergative argument, while in pari, described in more detail later, the verbal agreement is only present in a particular topicalization construction. I would finally like to note that there are in fact good theoretical reasons for these patterns. One of them, that of markedness, has already been used to explain the gap in the final column. However, a fuller discussion of the theory behind the rest of the table, and why the universal in the middle of the screen is true, will have to wait until split ergativity and the animacy hierarchy are discussed later. The prior discussion is probably sufficient for now. Two separate cross-referencing systems. This section isn't about ergativity per se, aside from the fact that the agreement systems here all equate S and O in some way, but is a fascinating area that Dixon covers which I wanted to include. In the majority of languages with verbal agreement, the verb agrees with at least two arguments. There are actually families such as Indo-European which are less usual in having verbal agreement with only one argument. According to WALS, the World Atlas of Language Structures, there are 193 languages in which the verb agrees in person with both A and O, but only 97 in which the verb agrees in person with only one argument. However, there also exist more complex agreement systems in which two completely separate agreement systems are used at the same time. In Gavião, a clause contains one or more verbs as well as an auxiliary verb. There may be an explicit noun phrase, NP, in the role of S or A. If there isn't, the auxiliary takes a prefix indicating the person or number of the S or A argument. Similarly, if the verb is transitive, there may be an explicit noun phrase as the O argument. If there isn't, the verb takes a prefix indicating the person and number of the O argument. If the verb is not transitive, it takes a prefix agreeing with S instead. Thus, a Gavião clause contains two agreement markers. One on the auxiliary agrees with S or A, while the other on the verb agrees with S or O. Interestingly, both sets of agreement prefixes have almost exactly the same form, despite the fact that they mark separate sets of arguments. In Jarawara, there are two types of transitive construction. The A construction, used where the A argument continues an established topic, and the O construction, used where the O argument continues an established topic. There are also several suffixes attached to the auxiliary or verb. Many of these suffixes agree in gender with one argument of the verb. In the A construction, these suffixes agree with the A argument, whereas in the O construction, these suffixes agree with the O argument. The verb also contains another agreement system in the form of two obligatory bound pronominal slots in an accusative-nominative pattern. The first slot agrees with the O argument, and the second slot agrees with the S or A argument. The Papuan language Koyari also has two agreement mechanisms. According to Dixon, verbs in Koyari have suffixes indicating number of S or O, followed by a tense or aspect suffix which also encodes some information concerning the person or number of S or A. These systems are quite different from more normal systems of agreement, such as those of Swahili and Sakapultek outlined earlier. The verbal affixes in those two languages work as a single system. Even though there are two slots, they both encode the same information about the arguments, the only difference between the slots being that one agrees with A and the other agrees with O. By contrast, the three languages described just now, Gavião, Jarawara, and Koyari, each have two completely separate agreement systems. Each set of agreement affixes may convey completely different sorts of information, as in Jarawara and Koyari, or mark the same argument twice, present in all three examples. Ergative word order. So far, we have seen that ergative marking of arguments can manifest in case marking, through a case system with ergative and absolutive cases, as well as in verbal agreement, through the use of separate agreement affixes for ergative and absolutive arguments. So it seems only natural to ask, can ergativity manifest in word order as well? After all, there are many languages which use word order rather than case or agreement to mark which argument is which. Firstly, what would it mean for word order to show an ergative pattern? In languages such as English, word order in intransitive clauses is subject then verb, and the word order in transitive clauses is agent then verb then patient. Dixon represents such a system as SV/AVO, and I will use this same notation here. From this description, we could say that English has an accusative word order. S and A are in the same position in the sentence, and O is at a different place, with regards to the verb. An ergative word order then would be something like VS/AVO, where S and O are in the same position, and A is different. Note that A and O must be on different sides of the verb for a language to have ergative word order, although see the example of Sonoma later on. For instance, if a language has SV/AOV word order, then it cannot really be said to have either accusative or ergative word order. This is why many otherwise fully ergative languages show no evidence of ergative word order. Ergative languages are usually verb initial or verb final, and of course such languages cannot be said to have either ergative or accusative word order. Another logically possible case is tripartite word order, where all three arguments are treated differently. This is only possible if S is on one side of the verb and A and O are on the other, such as SV/VAO. As far as I am aware, there is no language with such a system. As it turns out, we know of no language which marks ergativity solely through word order, with the partial exception of the Austronesian language Tolai, which will be covered later. However, there are some languages where ergativity is shown by other means, but also have clearly ergative word order. The Nilotic language Pari, mentioned briefly above, has unmarked order SV in intransitive clauses and OVA in transitive clauses. A is marked with ergative case, whereas O is unmarked, or possibly marked with a null absolutive marker. There is, additionally, a construction which is used to topicalize the A argument. In this construction, A is fronted, changing the order to AOV, the ergative case marker is removed, and an affix agreeing with the agent is added. For instance, reading without bothering with the tones, ubur atuk, jobi akel uburri, ubur jobi akele. This means that Pari has intransitive word order SV and transitive word order OV, and A can either go before or after the OV unit. It is thus clear that Pari has ergative word order. The Carib language Kuikuro has a similar pattern to Pari. The basic word order is SV for intransitive clauses and either OVA or AOV for transitive clauses. The Nadeb language of Brazil has the basic order SV/OAV. An alternate word order is VS/AVO. Here, the basic unit of word order is V/AV, with S and O going either before or after this unit. Thus, S and O are treated the same with regard to word order, and A is treated differently. The Mayan language, Huastec, has an ergative system of verbal agreement, as is common in Mayan languages, such as Sakapultek described earlier. The most frequent word order in WASTEC is the ergative system VS/AVO, although Dixon notes that variation is possible. The Yanomami language Sanuma has basic word order SV/AOV. As mentioned above, this word order is neither accusative nor ergative. However, when peripheral noun phrases, denoted X, are taken into account, the word order becomes XSV/AXOV, which is clearly ergative. Finally, a warning from Dixon about determining ergativity purely from word ordering. It will be seen that all the languages quoted here as having some kind of ergative pattern in their constituent ordering show other ergative features at the level of intraclausal marking. Indeed, since constituent order fulfills a wide variety of pragmatic as well as grammatical functions, we should hesitate to characterize a language as ergative on the basis of constituent order alone. Well, that's the end of part 1, Morphological Ergativity. Next we'll be looking at split ergativity. Until then, thanks for watching, and as always, don't like and don't subscribe.